In RPG terms, if a fighter specializing in swords was forced to use an axe, could the sword skill be applied to it, or would it at least help? Well, you know what's coming, so say it with me. It depends. Of course it does. If we're talking about a large axe with a long haft, like this two-handed version of an Igorot headhunting axe, or a Dane axe, then no, this is a very different beast. Handles nothing like a sword, uses different grips and different tactics. Really only the fundamental basics carry over. Things like footwork and distance management and timing and striking from the body rather than just swinging with the arms. Things like that, but otherwise. A smaller axe is a different story, assuming it's not too clunky. The head of a tool axe tends to be thicker than a battle axe, so they usually weigh a little bit more on average. Again, it depends. There's a lot of different types of battle axes in history. This will also apply to warhammers, again, if it's a relatively light one. But I'm excluding maces because that's a different use case. What axes and swords have in common is that you do have to align the edge. It's not as important for an axe because even if it doesn't hit with perfect edge alignment, that's still a substantial impact. And warhammers as well, matters even less than with axes, but you still generally have to align them, and they are shaped in such a way, the handles, where you can feel how it's oriented, whereas a mace generally has a round handle. It doesn't matter, what kind of alignment? There is none. You just hit them from whatever angle with whatever part of it, doesn't matter. Okay, not whatever part, but you get the point. Same with disc maces. Doesn't really add anything more to the conversation. I just like to show it because disc maces are less known and underrated. So if a swordsman had to use this instead of that, or worse, instead of that, seems like a rotten deal because this is basically the exact opposite. In terms of mass distribution, this is more like a sword. It would definitely help to use both hands. Gives you a lot more control, but the reach is already bad compared to a sword. Now it's straight up lousy. You have to be so close, you can literally punch the guy. So that's a problem, but it might be worthwhile. So if you wanted to try to make sword techniques carry over and apply them to an axe, there are certain things you can definitely do. Like, for example, if I think about defense, static blocks seem like a bad idea for the most part because, well, there's nothing protecting your hands at all. Blade can slide down. You don't really want to take too many cuts against a wooden haft because eventually it'll fail. So this is probably not going to be a great idea as a defensive action. That's okay because there's more space between the hands and you can hide one hand behind the axe head to an extent at least. But I think rather than stopping an opponent's blade dead in its tracks, it would be a better idea to gently nudge it to persuade it to go elsewhere. With a sword, you might do something like deflect the opponent's blade with a false edge strike into it while using a triangle step to get out of the way. That works here too, except there is no false edge. So you would use the hammer pole or the back of the haft. Either way, same idea. All right, so you step over here and you knock it out of the way. And the good thing about that is it's unlikely to damage the haft of the axe because this would generally hit the flat of the opponent's blade. Either that or the edge at an angle, so it's not as likely to cause damage. So that's great. Now the problem, of course, is the terrible reach that you would have to compensate for. If the opponent has, say, a longsword and you manage to deflect, you're pretty far away. So you might have to spring forward and almost do a lunge to cover as much distance as quickly as possible. Of course, the problem is the opponent can also move away as soon as they see you doing that. So you have to be quite fast. But it is theoretically plausible. Or I guess if you're feeling devious, you could deflect, throw. If you're good at throwing an axe like this, could work. But if it fails, of course, you're kind of toast. This could be done with one hand. You could just beat it aside and then try to attack like this. But what I like about using both hands is not just extra control. Also, like you get this twisting action by moving the left hand under your right arm, or vice versa if you're left-handed, of course. And from there, the swordsman with the axe could use sort of a desperation move. Maybe I shouldn't call it that, but from here, letting go with the main hand suddenly gives you kind of an explosive bonus in reach. Sometimes I gesture like a supervillain, don't I? Anyway, so boom, this. This is still not the most reach compared to a sword, but quite a bit more than just doing this, or even trying to reach with the other side, because with the footwork, you can't see my footwork, but for an evasive triangle step, you would end up with the left foot behind. So in order to then hit, you would have to step forward. So now the left leg is forward, and so it's kind of crossing over. Like this is the most reach you can have. Right leg forward, right arm forward. If you step, then this shortens. Could also be done from the other side. If you take what would be a fool's guard with longsword, and same as with a sword, beat and then come back around. The nice thing is you can keep using the momentum. So boom, there. Again, reach is a problem, but it's in and of itself mechanically sound. Half swording techniques from armored sword fighting also apply here. If you think about blocking like this and then wrenching with the guard, right? And then maybe cutting from there or striking with the pommel, things like that, or wrenching in the other direction and then thrusting. I could see that being done here. So block, wrench, and now if you want the reach, you would just punch forward with it. Now, of course, without a spike or anything, you may not see the point, but would you want this in your face? I sure wouldn't. And if not, so block, wrench, release, chop. Against an opponent with a single-handed sword that's not terribly long, I could also imagine using Dussac-like techniques where you lean forward and then when the opponent cuts, you lean back to evade it and then you come back forward. Now with a heavier axe that would be kind of clunky, or at least the recovery would be unless you follow all the way through, meaning you chop and then you come back up. With a lighter axe and something that's safer to use in a room with limited space, I could definitely see that working, especially if the axe swordsman lets the axe kind of hang out there to invite the opponent to try to beat it, because that would be a lot worse with an axe than with a sword. I mean, there are beats against sword blades, of course, and it does take a while to recover that, but particularly if you have most of the mass here, this can really throw you off. Although on the upside, because you have that much mass, there's also more inertia, so it takes more to displace it to begin with. But either way, so you could kind of invite that and then evade, chop. Now there's one good defensive action with a sword that unfortunately doesn't carry over to an axe, and that is a deflectional parry wherein you allow the opponent's blade to slide off. You basically create a ramp and just let it slide down, and then you can counter. Depending on how you do it, this may even power your riposte. You basically redirect that energy into the counter cut. Quite useful. Unfortunately, you cannot create that ramp with an axe. As you can imagine, for one, the axe head is likely to catch the blade, but even if you angle it in such a way to try to minimize that, this is still a wooden handle. So rather than just sliding off, this would likely cut into it and then get stuck there. So instead of being able to power your counter, it will probably just pull you down a little, and then you would have to kind of unstick it and then counter maybe. So that does not this kind of number would not work properly. Otherwise, I don't see too many sword techniques that would be viable with an axe. I already touched on thrusts. You know, there are situations where the swordsman could just push the axe head in the opponent's face, but it's not as effective as with a sword. You're not exactly going to perform an inquartata with an axe like in rapier fencing. That'd be a sight to behold. Instead, trying to apply longsword techniques to a beast like this. I mean, if you were to hold it like a longsword this far down, it would be insane because you already know what kind of destructive power this design here has. So if you choke down to lengthen the lever even more, you might actually destroy the planet. But the recovery would be disastrous. I mean, just imagine you have to follow all the way through. I can't even do that in this room because it takes so much space. I guess if you swung it like a montante, like a greatsword, you keep it going in these big sweeping circles, that might kind of work actually. But yeah, I do think it's better to switch the grip and alternate the distance between the hands and hand position depending on the side that you're cutting from, etc. There's a lot of things that you would do differently compared to a sword. Also, just imagine holding it like this and the opponent manages to bind the axe head or strikes into it for that matter, and suddenly you're left in a very awkward position and it's going to take a bit to recover from that. I mean, the good thing with an axe is you can just pull it, right? So it may not be that bad necessarily because the haft can slide in the hand. It's not exactly ideal. I mean, neither is this entire hypothesis. Someone trained in the use of swords having to adjust to axes it's not the easiest if there's no prior experience at all. So it would, in other words, in RPG terms, it would come with a hefty skill penalty, but it's definitely not one of the least doable things. Like applying polearm skill to whips. Anyway, I hope you found this entertaining. Thanks for watching, and take care, folks. Love this thing. It's just the most badass axe ever. Don't you agree? You better.